All right, good morning. We are in the middle of a series about God's faithfulness. And while it's true that God is faithful, we've sung about that this morning, sometimes it's really, really hard to trust your kids and grandkids to God. So you wait expectantly for them to join your family, and you have hopes and dreams for them. If you're a Christian, you want them to come to know Jesus personally and have a deep, committed relationship with him. You also want them to become part of a church and get to know a group of people who love Jesus and want to follow him. So this is how I felt when our kids were born. We had 3 birth children. And also when we adopted our daughter. All of them we wanted to just have this wonderful growing relationship with God's people and with God. But sometimes, and perhaps usually for most families, things don't work out quite the way that we expect. We hope and we plan and we pray, and then things go off. There's lots of reasons for this. Probably the first one is that they have minds and wills of their own. We have all these ideas of what they should do and be, and they're not buying it. Sometimes it's we're not the best parents. Sometimes life just happens to us. Sometimes there are bad decisions. And then sometimes life just goes off the rails for all sorts of different reasons. So I know that I tend to want for life to go from point A to point B in a straight line. And you start here and you just go there. But that's not the way life usually works, at least not in my experience. Oftentimes there are problems with addiction, there are backtracks, there are crises, there are lots of different difficult experiences that we have. And so instead of this nice, happy thing from going from birth to a wonderful, successful life where nothing as bad has ever happened to you, that's not reality for most people. So one of the reasons why I love reading stories from Genesis, the first book of the Bible, is because it has, instead of going from point A to point B stories, they have stories where people are all over the map and they're going here and they're going there and have crises in their families, and it's just a mess. And you think, and this is God's chosen people? But they are. They have make bad decisions, they have troubled marriages and dysfunctional families, and they end up in places where they never expected to be. Yet, God still is at work in their lives, and he draws them to himself. And so, the nice thing about reading a book like Genesis is that you get to see somebody's birth, and then you get to see their death. And it's like you get the whole picture there, instead of just seeing a little bit of it, which is the way that we usually see most of our lives, is we're right in the middle of our own story, as Pastor Lindsay reminded us a couple of weeks ago. And so it's hard to see the beginning and the end from where we are in the middle. But God is still with us, as we sang about this morning. And so this morning, I want to tell you about 2 different stories. One of them is the story of Jacob. And we won't go through the whole story because it's a long story. But we'll go through a significant part of it. And then I want to tell you a story about my family. And the story about my family is how our adopted daughter, Emily, truly became part of our family. And you probably know that there's a difference between when you adopt somebody and they are technically part of your family and when they are truly part of your family. So that's what I want to talk about this morning. So the story of Jacob is found in the book of Genesis. And it's interesting, Jacob has a hard time wanting to be part of God's family. You think about him, he had his grandfather Abraham, who was given promises by God and left the land where he lived and moved out with his whole family and went all the way to what we call the land of Israel, which is quite a ways away. It's a long journey. And he did this, and he accepted God's promises, even though it took a very long time for God to fulfill those promises. But he did have a son, and that son's name was Isaac. And God gave those very same promises to Isaac. And then Isaac had some sons too. So when Isaac's wife Rebekah was pregnant with her two sons, she had twins, she had a really difficult pregnancy. And so she went to go and figure out, we don't know exactly how she did this, but she found somebody who would give her an oracle about what was going on inside of her during this pregnancy. And they said that she had two nations struggling inside of her, and that her older son Esau would serve the younger, who was Jacob. Now, as the boys grew up, they were very different. Esau was strong and outdoorsy and a hunter, and he was his dad's favorite. And Jacob was very clever, and he stayed close to home, and he took care of the family flocks. And he was Mom Rebekah's favorite. So as you might predict, they did not have a good relationship with each other. There was lots of animosity and sibling rivalry and competing for parental appreciation, and it was kind of a mess. And then an example of this is once Esau was out hunting, and he hadn't really brought along enough supplies, and so he stumbles across Jacob, who's probably out herding sheep, and Jacob's making dinner, and Esau says, "Let me have some of your dinner." Jacob said, "No." "But I'm starving." "No." "Please give me some of your dinner." "Well, what will you give me if I give some to you?" And so Esau sold his birthright, which meant that in that situation, the older son got a double portion of his father's inheritance instead of just the single portion. And so what Esau said, "Oh, fine, if I'm dying, what good is a double portion to me?" And so he sold that extra portion to his brother for a bowl of lentil soup. These two brothers were not friendly with each other. And then years later, when Isaac was old and blind, and he's thinking, "Gee, I don't know how much longer I'm going to live. I better get things sorted out here." And actually, he lived quite a lot longer than he expected. But he decided he wanted to settle his estate, and he wanted to make sure that Esau got the estate that he thought Esau was due, and he wanted to bless him. So he sent Esau out hunting to get some meat for a festive meal, and his wife Rebekah overheard this conversation and figured out what was going on. And so she decided, okay, now it's time for me to act, because she wanted Jacob to get the firstborn blessing instead of Esau. So you think, this is a mom who knows how everything is supposed to work in this family, and instead of allowing her older son to get the blessing, she's trying to figure out a way of cheating him out of it so her favorite can get it. So you can see how dysfunctional this family is. So she cooked some special food, and she had Jacob impersonate his brother. So you can imagine how Esau felt when he returned home. He'd just been out hunting. He made some special food. He came into his dad and said, "Okay, give me the blessing." And his dad said, "I already gave you the blessing." No, you didn't." Yes, I did." And then figured out what had happened. So Esau was pretty angry about this, and he decided that since his father was going to be dying pretty soon anyway, that he might as well just kill his brother after his father died. And so then Rebekah, his mom, figured out what was going on again. I'm not sure exactly how she knew that he was making these plans, but she did. And so she decided that it was now time for Jacob to go get married. And she didn't want him to marry any of the local women. She wanted him to marry somebody from her family. So she decided that he needed to go to Uncle Laban's house, which was a safe 550 miles away. Now, both parents probably expected that Jacob would go, he would find a wife, allow Esau to cool down a little bit, and just everything would be fine, that Jacob would come back, they could meet the wife, or all that sort of stuff. Everything would be fine. Life would go on as it should. But this didn't happen. And before Isaac sends Jacob off, he sends his son off with this blessing. And so if you can put up the slide, please. There. May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and increase your numbers until you become a community of peoples. May he give you and your descendants the blessing he'd given to Abraham so that you may take possession of the land where you now reside as a foreigner, the land God gave to Abraham. So Isaac is saying to Jacob, who he now realizes that's the one I blessed with all of the family blessings and everything. He's getting sent off, so may God give him the family blessing that I gave him already. And may that blessing get passed on through his family as well. So with that blessing ringing in his ears, Jacob stopped for the night at a place called Luz. And chapter 28 of Genesis tells us that he had a dream while he was sleeping. So starting at verse 12, is that one up? Not yet. Oh, there. It says, he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. You might know this as Jacob's ladder, but it really wasn't a ladder, it was a staircase. And the idea is that God's house was up on top, and then he would descend down this staircase, and his angels would descend down the staircase to the place of human worship. But then he would go back up to his house up above. So that's the idea here. And so up at the top it says, there above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. So Jacob is sleeping there. He has this dream, and God gives him the promises that God gave his grandfather and also his father. Now, if you were Jacob and this had happened to you and you'd had this dramatic dream, what would you do? If it were me, I would think, wow, this is amazing. And that I probably would build an altar and I would do some worshiping and whatever they would do normally in those sorts of situations at that time. But what did Jacob do? Did he do that? No. Instead, he did what we often do. He tried to make a deal with God. And this is typical of Jacob's personality. It's like he's always trying to keep the upper hand and get ahead of somebody, even God. And so he says to God, if God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I am taking and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear so that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God, and this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give you, God, a tenth. So he's saying, all right, you've made these promises to me. I don't believe you. But if this does happen, then I'll decide I'll worship you. So, despite God's promises, Jacob was not going to commit to him unless God demonstrated his trustworthiness and blessed Jacob first. And isn't this the way that we are? We pray, we think, we have lots of faith, but then we stand back and say, okay, God, make it happen, make it happen. There isn't that true faith that wells up within us that says, God, I'm lifting this up to you, and you do with it what you want. I know your promises are true, and I'll trust you. Usually that's not how we respond. So when Jacob got to Uncle Laban's home, which was about a month later because that's a very long journey, he immediately fell in love with his cousin Rachel. And he bargained with his uncle to work as a herdsman for 7 years so that he could marry her. And what Jacob didn't know was that deceit and dysfunction were not just in his particular family, but it was a family trait across the family. And so Laban was even more of a trickster than Jacob himself was and his mother was. So on Jacob's wedding night, after working for 7 years, Laban substituted Leah, his oldest daughter, for Rachel's older sister, for Rachel. And the next morning, when the impersonation, hear the word impersonation again? There's a theme going on here. The impersonation was revealed. Laban offered Rachel as wife number 2, but to marry her, Jacob would have to work another 7 years for his father-in-law. And then after that, Jacob had to work another 6 years for being able to have some of the goats and the sheep that he had been working on for the last 14 years. So after 13 more years after this second marriage, and 13 years of marital turmoil and bickering between the first 2 wives, and then 2 additional wives and 11 children, and Laban financially cheating him, Jacob had another dream. And in it, God told him that it was time to leave Haran and return home to the land that God had promised him. Jacob had become a very wealthy man by this point, and that really annoyed his father-in-law and his father-in-law's sons as well. So he decided that while they were off shearing their flock of sheep in another area that was 3 days' journey away, that he would gather up his stuff and head back to Canaan, the land where he had come from. So when Uncle Laban and his sons finally found out about it, they raced after them and caught up with them as they were just about to cross into the promised land. And there was a lot of accusations and arguing going on, but finally they made a compact with each other, Laban and Jacob. And then Jacob's family and all of his possessions were allowed to just keep moving forward towards home. But if you might remember, Jacob now had a problem. Once he crossed into the promised land, he was crossing into land that had been promised not only to him, but to his ancestors, and that Esau thought that he should be the one who owned. And Esau was probably still pretty angry. This is like 20 years after he left. But if you know anything about grudges and things like that, 20 years doesn't mean that the grudge has gone away. It's still there, especially if you have been deeply wronged by someone you cared for or thought cared for you. So Jacob had cheated Esau not only out of his firstborn blessing, but he had also cheated him out of his birthright money or inheritance. And Esau was probably still really ticked with him. So what could he do? So he decided, well, we're gonna grease the way before me. So he sent some messengers out to Esau, which was quite a ways away from where he was currently, and thought, well, I'll just let him know that we're coming so that we don't stumble on him accidentally, or he doesn't stumble on us. And so when the messengers returned, they said, okay, Esau is coming, and he's got 400 men with him. And Jacob thought, oh boy, I'm in really big trouble. I've got all these flocks here, and I've got my wives and 11 children, plus servants, and we're not making a lot of progress each day. There's just a lot of us to try and move along and keep track of, and we move slowly. And if he's coming at us with an army of 400 men, we're in big trouble. What can I do now? So he decides he's going to go through his flocks and choose some of the choice animals and then he's going to divide the rest of the flocks up into groups. And then he's going to send 3 groups of these choice animals on ahead of him, like a day or 2 ahead of him, to meet Esau. And hopefully appease Esau's anger and hopefully say, I'm paying you back for your lost birthright. Because it was a substantial amount in terms of finances that these animals were worth. So Jacob is thinking, well, at least I can try and pay him back a little bit, and maybe he won't be so mad at me. So that's what they do. And then he moves his family and his possessions across the Jabbok River, which is kind of a bordering line, and is trying to figure out, okay, how can I keep them safe? What am I going to do? But he remains on the other side as well. And that night, while he's over on the other side, apart from his family, he's attacked by a stranger. And he doesn't know who this stranger is, but they have this wrestling match that lasts until the dawn. And when the dawn starts breaking, this stranger says, let me go. And Jacob says, I'm not letting you go unless you bless me. And we don't know who this stranger was. Most people think it was an angel that was struggling with him. But we don't really know. It doesn't say. But Jacob refuses to let him go. And so this stranger then dislocates Jacob's hip. So it's like, and all of things, he collapses in a heap. I mean, he can't do anything if he can't stand. So with this dislocated hip and thigh bone, then this person says to Jacob, you know what? You're not going to be called Jacob any longer. You're going to be called Israel. And Israel means one who has wrestled or striving with God. And all of a sudden, Jacob starts thinking, what's just happened to me? He was thinking he was just dealing with some maybe strange attacker, a local robber, but all of a sudden, he's given a new name, and this name has a really important significance. Somebody who has battled or wrestled with God. So he's thinking, who is this person that I've been battling with all night? And he never finds out who that is. The man disappears. But when Esau and his men come the next morning, Jacob decides he's going to walk ahead of his family, and he bows down 7 times before his brother, showing that he's submitting to the authority of his brother. And fully expecting that Esau and his men are going to attack. But Esau doesn't attack. Esau walks up to him and throws his arm around him and kisses him, and they talk. And you can just imagine if you're doing a movie, what this would look like. It'd be very dramatic. That was not at all what Jacob was expecting. He wasn't expecting forgiveness. He wasn't expecting that his brother would be wanting to be reconciled with him. But that's what happened. So after protesting about accepting all those choice animals that were sent on ahead, Esau finally says, okay, I'll accept those. That'll be fine. And so he does. And then Esau says he's going to escort them back to his house. And Jacob says, I'm not so sure about that. And so instead of going south to Esau's house, he goes west. And he gets to a town called Shechem, and then he builds an altar there. And the altar is called the altar of God, the God of Israel. Not the God of Jacob, the God of Israel. And then there's another family crisis, and so he has to leave that area. And then he finally gets down to Bethel, which is the place where he had the dream, and he builds another altar there. And he tells his family, I'm making this altar to the God who answered me in my day of distress and who has been with me wherever I go. And all of a sudden, you see that there's been this transformation in Jacob. He's no longer Jacob, he's Israel. He's given his heart to the Lord, and now he is God's servant. And God is his God. So there's more to Jacob's story, but that's where we're going to leave it. And so Psalm 146 says, "Blessed are those whose help is in the God of Jacob, whose hope is in the Lord their God." And the reason why that's true is because God was so faithful to Jacob, well, faithful to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, so that Jacob, the one who was trying to deceive and wanting to wrestle with God and not take God very seriously, becomes Israel. God is now his God. So now I want to switch and talk a little bit about the story of our daughter Emily, Ron and my daughter, and when she really became part of our family, and how the story of Jacob gave me some hope during very difficult times. So when I talked with Emily this week, she gave me permission to tell you her story. So she said, tell them whatever you want to tell them. That's fine with me. And so when Ron and I were planning on having our family, we hoped to have a girl. I come from a family of 3 girls, and my parents adopted a boy because they figured they wouldn't be having a boy. And we had 3 boys and decided to adopt a girl because we figured we would not be having a girl. And so we had previously thought and decided about adoption, and then through a sermon that somebody gave, both Ron and I came away from that sermon going, oh, God wants us to adopt, and so we started the process. And the social worker told us that they would only consider us for a girl that would be older than our boys, or younger, so we decided to look for an older girl, and Emily was eventually placed in our home. And one reason why we had chosen her is that she'd been going to church with some friends, and that she said she wanted to be part of a church family and wanted to be part of a family that actually was involved with the church. So Emily was almost 13 when she moved in, and we were her 3rd adoptive family due to no fault of her own. And we had lots of hopes and dreams for her. And at first, things seemed to be going really well, and then they went downhill. She didn't want brothers, and especially annoying and little ones, and she really didn't want a mom, since she was still very bonded to her birth mom that she had been taken away from because of abuse and neglect. She and I went to counseling weekly. I read books. We did all sorts of things to try and make this relationship go and work. And nothing worked. It was a very, very difficult time. She really didn't want to be part of our family, and she did her best to push us away, and especially me, push me away. So a couple of years after her adoption, we went to a women's conference, and the speaker talked about the life of the patriarch Jacob. She spoke about his dysfunctional family, his cleverness, his deceptiveness, and how he was sent away from his family for his own safety. And the speaker said that despite all of that, God still had his hand on Jacob and was calling him into relationship with himself. And that he would bless him with the promises that were given to Abraham. And the speaker talked about how Jacob's life was a process. And that you look at it at one point, it would look very different from another point. And in it, we could see how God worked in a very difficult person and eventually developed him into a man of faith who was reconciled with his family. When she was talking about Jacob's story, it was like, oh, I can't believe this. Maybe there's hope for Emily and our family. But while Emily lived with us, things did not get better. And she did a lot of things that you would never want your daughter to do. So when she turned 18, after about 5 very difficult years, and sometimes scary years because of the stuff she was doing, we put her stuff on the front porch, kicked her out of the house, changed the locks, and breathed a sigh of relief. But also at the same time, feeling like we had really failed her as parents. But God wasn't done with Emily, and he wasn't done with us. About 2 years later, she called us because she wanted to reconnect with her birth mom and thought we might be able to help. And so we helped her in that process. And Emily's dream of reconnecting with her birth mom was shattered when she met her birth mom, and her birth mom was high on cocaine and yelled at Emily and told her to get the whatever out of here because she didn't want wanted to be in a relationship with her anymore. So Emily was in this hard place, just like Jacob was in a hard place. What should he do? What should she do? So she called us back up and said, I'd like to reconcile with the family. I want to be part of a family. So the very family that she had rejected, she now wanted to be part of. And so after going through a several-month reconciliation process, we attended her wedding just before her 21st birthday. But by that time, she was quite addicted to drugs and alcohol, and she struggled to cope, especially after her first daughter and her son were born. But she got involved with Alcoholics Anonymous, got sober, and was determined to do the steps so that she could be a good mom to her 3 kids at this point and pull her life back together. She attended family gatherings, and our family relationship grew. She began working as a caregiver for elderly in nursing homes and care facilities, and eventually earned a CNA and other certificates. And her ability to care for and be patient with older people, especially those with dementia, was amazing. As she matured, I could see that God was faithfully at work in her life. So I personally began to see how amazingly gifted Emily was in 2017, when my stepmom had a fatal brain aneurysm. My stepmom had been my dad's caregiver, and my dad struggled with some memory loss, neuropathy, and probably the beginnings of Parkinson's. And so Emily loved my dad. And as my stepmom was dying in the hospital, and he was being discouraged from visiting by my stepmom's family, Emily insisted that he had to go to the hospital and say goodbye. So she came with me, helped me get my dad out of the car and to move through the hospital. And she was there the whole time that I was saying goodbye to my dad, goodbye to my stepmom with my dad. When my stepmom passed, I was suddenly my dad's caregiver, full-time. Or not taking care of him physically, but I was his go-to person, his transportation, his power of attorney, the person that he called at 8 o'clock in the morning when something was wrong almost every day. And it was a very difficult time. I helped him with the probate of his wife's will, which was very long and drawn out and complicated. And then my dad needed to move to an adult family home because he needed more care. And Emily, again, stepped in, and she had lots of experience in elder care placement. She researched homes that were near our area, took us on tours, and found a great place for him. So early in 2019, shortly after my stepmom probate was completed, my dad took a severe downturn, both physically and psychologically. He became delusional and combative and ended up in the hospital several times. And Emily was with me through that whole process. The day that he died, I had been with him all day, and Emily came to relieve me about 6 p.m., saying that she would stay with him all night if needed. And about 9:30 that night, she called to say that she thought he was close to death and that we should come and say goodbye. When we arrived, she had soft music playing in the background, the lights were dimmed, and she was holding his hand. She took off his wedding ring and gave it to me and told me to put it on. And I still have it on right here. We prayed and talked to my comatose dad until he died about half hour later. And then she sent Ron and I home while she waited for the funeral home to come and get his body. In retrospect, I cannot say enough about how blessed I was that Emily was there for me with her support, her wisdom and encouragement. We had no idea that when we adopted her and struggled through the difficult years in our home, how much of a blessing she would be to us 19 years later when we were going through really hard times with my dad. But God knew that, He knew how much we needed her, and he knew also how much she needed us. And there's no question at this point that Ron and I are her dad and her mom, and our family can't imagine Emily not being a part of it. God answered us in our day of distress, and he has been with us. He has been truly faithful to Emily and to us. But a final note. You might be going through a really difficult time with your kids or grandkids or other family members. And it seems like God isn't listening. Your prayers are bouncing off the ceiling. And I know how that feels. I know that not every story of family dysfunction, difficulty, and pain has a happy resolution like ours. Not everything in Jacob's story had a happy ending either. While he eventually reconciled with his brother, he saw his father before he died and helped bury him, he never saw his mom again. Apparently, she died when he was living with Uncle Laban. We just spent a couple days with our grandkids over in Yakima, and so this part of the story really touches me because we had a wonderful time with them. And so I keep thinking about that when I think about her. I keep thinking about how she never got to meet Jacob's wives, plural wives, to play with his children, and even to see him again. The son that she had been willing to even trick her own husband for. So she wanted to meet him and see him, but none of that happened because she died. So it's not like everything turns out wonderfully, even for Jacob. Even though God has been with him and cared for him and brought him back into the land, there's still a great deal of pain. I have good friends whose children struggle with mental illness, and up to now they've rejected their parents and their faith. But in spite of that, Jacob's story and Emily's story still encourages me to have hope that God is at work in my friends and their kids, even if they and I can't see it. And I still have hope in the middle of their story. Their kids are in a process where God is continuing to draw them to himself, and I still hope that God will be faithful to my friends and their wayward kids, like he was with us and Emily and Jacob and his family. And I can hope that he will be faithful to you too. So blessed are those whose help is the God of Jacob, whose hope is in the Lord their God. Amen.